Welcome to the Theologically Fashioned Podcast. I'm your host, Monica. This is a podcast where we have conversations that help us yield our hearts to the Lord. I am really excited. Today we have on Dr. Grace Hamman, and we're going to talk about your book. It's called Ask of Old Paths and Medieval Virtues and Vices for a Whole and Holy Life. And Grace, we're going to talk about this book. You do some really, really cool things with it. So we're going to get into all that. But first, I'd love to hear more about you. You have a doctorate in medieval poetry. Is that correct?
Basically, yes, I do. I have a doctorate in English, and I specialize in medieval contemplative writing and poetry from like the 14th and 15th centuries in English.
Mm-hmm.
And I got that in 2019 from Duke University, and it's definitely not your run-of-the-mill topic. It's pretty niche, but I really love it, and I'm always trying to get more people to read medieval poetry and writing. So.
How did that start? What is there one specific piece of writing that kind of just grabbed your heart and you were like, yes, this is it? Or was it just kind of over time, like, oh, I love how this works? Or how did that come about?
I mean, it's one of those things that I feel like I tell like three different origin stories for it because it was so many pieces of the puzzle that came together over time. So one was that as a kid, even, I was super into words and into history and language. And I always loved reading so much. And specifically, like historical fiction was just my favorite thing ever. And so I had always loved that. And then I had discovered at some point that words have individual histories.
Mm.
And that like totally blew my mind. And I got into it through naming books, like baby name books. Like I was like in seventh grade, like really into baby name books because they told you all the like meanings of the names and stuff. And
Yeah.
that words worked that way too. I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. So clearly I was a real hit at school. I was a real nerd. But no, I just loved it. And then I got an English degree and I kind of started reading Middle English. And I took this class called History of the English Language, and it just kind of blew my mind and fit with all those weird little interests. And then I read the poem called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is a Middle English poem. It's alliterative. It's some of the most beautiful poetry. It's just
Mhm.
glorious. And all of these interests kind of slotted together in this because what I failed to mention is that being an English major and being raised in wonderful public schools, but that were obviously very secular. I loved my education, but there was no talk of faith or anything. And then in Middle English, you really can't run away at
Mhm.
all from faith and from talking about Jesus. And so it was like all the things all of a sudden fit together. My love of God, my love of words, my love of history.
Mhm.
This is where I ended up.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I mean, it's a really cool book how you bring all those things together. For those that are wondering, when is the medieval time period? I know it's big. I know it's
No, this
big.
is always a really good question. And I'm always like, no one should ever be embarrassed because honestly, we get taught history in kind of a funny way sometimes. And the medieval era often gets kind of overlooked because you do so much with like the Romans and ancient
Mm-hmm.
history
Yes.
and the start of the church. And then you do so much with like the modern era, like post-Reformation, the European discovery of the Americas, da da da. So the medieval era is that giant, roomy, capacious time in between those things. So it's from about the fall of Rome-ish, year 500-ish, to the Reformation and
Hmm.
all the European Age of Discovery, all that in, around 1500. So that's a huge span of about 1,000 years.
Hmm.
And it's very different. It's not all the same during that time, but it kind of gets all lumped together because historians working in the 18th century wanted to unite themselves to the Roman period. They were like, we're enlightened like the Romans. All of this other stuff that happened in between, we're just like going to ignore and lump it together. So I do that later end of things, the 14th and 15th century, but
Hmm.
it's a huge time period. So I
And
don't. I don't like when people are confused by it, it makes sense to be confused by it. It's like kind of weird.
And there was a lot happening.
There was so much happening.
We obviously won't be covering
No.
all the many things that were happening during that time period. But can you tell me, just so people can kind of start to wrap their minds around, what are some of these things that maybe kind of came out of the medieval time period? Like, what were some basic, maybe like principles, Christian principles? What were the big questions that people were wrestling with during, I'm somewhat of this time period, right? Like, it's so
Yes. Yes.
great, but
Okay. So there's kind of in the earlier stages of this period, we have sort of the church and state getting cozier with each other, both for good and for ill. So the age of persecution and the age of Christians as a minority comes to an end, and we have sort of the rise of broad scale conversions, and that's in the very, very, very early medieval period around the fall of Rome and all that. And then we have it, what kind of begins to develop is monasticism becomes like a super central part of Christian culture, Christian life together. And this idea that you could devote your whole life to a life of prayer, and that was in the patristic era, in the classical era, there was no space for something like that. It was like, okay, you married and you had a family and you created these. And especially if you were in a powerful family, you had a responsibility to do that. So this idea that no, you could actually devote your life to prayer and live that way in community was a
Mhm.
huge Christian idea that changed a lot about how we think about human dignity, what humans are made for, how we can have a relationship, a personal relationship with God. All of that was coming into fruition over time. By this point, the Bible is already kind of a canon. We're not developing the canon anymore. The great creeds have already been written, so all of those are already there. So now we're in this interesting, more kind of social era, and things like the hospital, which is a Christian fully out of the church, comes into being, or the university
Mm.
that comes into being for the first time. And these are both originally profoundly Christian ideas. And I think that's what we forget today in
Yeah.
modernity because we think of those as being secular institutions or governmental or whatever.
Hmm.
Those are straight out of, hey, we should be reading the Bible more together and we should learn these things so that we can teach other people about them. Or, hey, we should be communally taking care of the poor and of the sick instead of casting them out on the outskirts of society. These are both directly out of the call for Christ to love our neighbors well.
Mm.
So, those are medieval institutions that we still have today. So those are
Wow.
just a few of the highlights, but that's kind of gives you a sense of some of these things. The rise of literacy begins,
Hmm.
um, and the rise of like prayer books
Yep.
for people who aren't. So in my era, the later era, we begin to see lay people, not monks, not priests, just ordinary people begin to go, hey, I want to pray and read like monks and nuns and priests do.
Hmm.
So that begins a rise in literacy. Um, and so all of that is all connected to the life of faith, which is really interesting.
It's so interesting. I feel like you said, a lot of people skip over this time period, but so much of faith formation happens in this
Yes.
time period.
Yes.
And when you think about, you hear this saying, right? Like, there's no new question, right?
Absolutely.
Great thinkers have already thought
Yes.
about this stuff. So don't skip over what these individuals have to say about,
Absolutely.
right? So many questions that we're still wrestling
Mhm.
with today. They've already thought about it. Um, okay, just I want to back up just a hair. And what were some questions that were really big in this time period that people were
Yes.
wrestling with?
So one question that people were continually trying to figure out is sort of life pleases God the most? Which is
Oh.
kind of a funny question. We don't really think of things in those terms today as much, but they were asking, okay, you know, St. Paul talks about celibacy and
Hmm.
not getting married a lot. So does
Hmm.
that mean that the life of celibacy and not getting married and vowed life in a convent or wandering around like St. Francis or whoever, does that mean that that life is most pleasing to God? Like, can we get closer to God if that's the kind of life that we choose? So that's one huge question is what is the shape of a life that pleases God look like? And that answer shifts throughout the centuries, but that's one consistently medieval question is how do we
Interesting.
live this life? What shape is pleasing in God's eyes? And then another question is how do we pray? Prayer is like the cornerstone of
Yeah.
medieval theology, medieval life together. So obviously the rise of monasticism and monks and nuns, this is central to their vocation. But then in the later Middle Ages, that spreads out into, hey, I can still pray a lot in my ordinary life as like a merchant or a housewife or a brewer or fill in the blank, whatever it is. I
Hmm.
can still be devout in prayer. That's not just closed off to the monks and the nuns and people who professionally pray.
Hmm.
And so a ton of different kinds of prayer begins to emerge in the Middle Ages, whether that's contemplative prayer, gazing at an image in order to meditate and learn, memorization of the Psalms and scripture passages, or just the repetition of a lot of the liturgical prayers.
Hmm.
So there are a lot of books about it. There's a lot of discussion around it. If you read medieval works, a ton of them are centered on how can I pray? Like, how can I have a more faithful prayer
Yeah.
life? Like, that's a huge question for them.
I was introduced in, I can't remember what class it was. I don't remember. One of my seminary classes, we had read, I was introduced to some of the mystics
Yes.
and started reading, gosh, I'm going to say it wrong. Madam starts with a G. I don't remember now. But
Guion, who's a
yes.
little later, but not much
Okay.
later. She's like in the 17th century. Yeah.
So I read one of her works on prayer, and
Mhm.
it's so lovely. It just changed
Absolutely.
the way that I saw prayer and brought it into such new. I always say, like, my seminary experience brought me my faith from black and white into a whole lot of color.
Yes.
And so I felt like reading it was just so much color. It's like,
Yes.
oh, okay, so prayer can look like this. Prayer
Yes.
can be that. And it just felt like freedom and
Yes.
color. And it was a lovely experience. Okay, shifting gears just a little bit and talking about one of the questions that they were wrestling with, what shape of a life do I live that's pleasing to God? Something you talk about in your book, this was also newly introduced to me in my seminary journey, is a whole and holy life. Like,
Mhm.
what does that mean to have a whole and holy life? And I love that you give the example. And I wish I would have caught on to this example. Like, I actually just turned in a manuscript for a book on spiritual disciplines and spiritual formation. I was like, why didn't I use this example? This example is better than my example. But you use the example of the man on the mat in the Gospel of John. Can you walk us through that because I think it explains so beautifully, like this mystery of spiritual formation.
Yes. So I think like what we're always worried about when we talk about spiritual formation is that we're going to start thinking in terms of like works righteousness or something like that, you know?
Mhm.
But I loved how in John 5, you know, there's the story of the man by the pool and he can't get into the pool and he's been there a long time. And then Jesus comes along and asks the man, do you want to be made well? That's how our modern English translations render it. But in Middle English, the translation was, wilt thou be made whole? Do you will to be made whole? And then of course the man says yes, and Jesus heals him, and then he says, take up your mat and walk. And now medieval theologians like Thomas Aquinas, they saw in this story this interaction between this man and Jesus. It kind of encapsulates salvation and sanctification.
Hmm.
So the man can't heal himself. He is helpless. He can't get into the pool. He can't heal himself. But Jesus heals him, and it's all Jesus. But then Jesus says to the man, get up and walk, take up your mat. And he invites him into a cooperation, into
Hmm.
being formed through his own actions and through the healing work of Christ together, not in competition, but Thomas Aquinas calls it participation. We participate in our sanctification.
Mm.
And that's kind of the distinction between sanctification and salvation is that sanctification is about this journey into wholeness that we are invited into alongside Jesus. We're not passive. We're not robots who get a part fixed. We're humans who are formed
Hmm.
through what we do and how we think and the things that we are given. All of those things work together. And so we walk forward. We take those steps ourselves even though they were impossible without the graced intervention of Christ.
Mm.
And so the word whole to me became a really powerful word because it's the ancient roots of the word whole come from the same roots of the word health and the word holy and the word hallow and hail, like hale and hearty. All those things come from the same really ancient roots. And that's kind of what this word whole expresses is that it's about spiritual health, mental health, physical health, all the things together that we are called into as we follow Jesus. And that's what sanctification means.
Mm. I just love that definition, I think, of wholeness because, again, that was like a new concept for me because a question that I always wrestled with was why?
Yeah.
Why am I doing, like, what am I doing?
Yes,
Why am I doing this?
totally.
Like, again, it's kind of along the lines of, how am I pleasing God?
Mhm.
But also why? Like,
Yes.
I'm a big why person. And so, again, just love the idea that I'm not the first person to ask this. I won't be the last. And we have these really amazing thinkers that have done so much work for us. So
Really.
tell me about why we need the language of the vices and the virtues of medieval times that you talk about in your book.
Yeah. So I think like many of us struggle with it's all well and good to say, I want to be whole, right? We all want that. Like, that's a
Mhm.
pretty clear, easy thing to want. But in order to want something, well, we kind of have to know what it is. And so that sometimes that's easier than other times, but it's hard for us to know what wholeness is unless we have a vocabulary for it. And so the virtues and vices, they aren't words that I really used like growing up or anything.
Hmm.
Like I knew what they were. Everybody knows what these words are, sort of, but they aren't kind of significant to thinking about my faith or my walk with God or my relationships with other people. They weren't
Hmm.
significant to me. And I started reading these medieval texts and I was kind of blown away by the strangeness and the power and the creativity that was encapsulated in these different words that I had dismissed as kind of like boring or goody two-shoes or even like repressive. And so that was really surprising to me. And then I started thinking more about them and I was like, you know what? My own moral vocabulary, actually, it's not like I have better words for those concepts. It's just that I'm not like thinking about them at all. I can talk about being patient, but I think of it almost as like a passivity sometimes. I don't have a word for like active patience that counteracts wrath,
Hmm.
which is what medieval people would have called meekness. And meekness to me is such like such an unpleasant word. It's like timidity or being a doormat. But then
Right.
but I didn't have a word for that concept that they're using meekness for. And so I began to realize that I needed a better set. I needed to reevaluate those words for myself. I needed a better set for my moral vocabulary because when I'm in relationships with people, in relationships with God, I want to be able to think about how I'm loving them well or not loving them well.
Hmm.
And you kind of need those words in order to do that.
And I think something you do a great job of is giving words such depth. And again, I'm going to use the idea of color. You give
Mhm.
them so much color because as you engage with these really deep thinkers, it kind of is like, oh, I didn't think about it that way. And you give like the counter to it, right? So that's kind of cool. How we can say, oh, well, this is the counter to that. And I want to walk us through an example in a minute. But first of all, so you go through the vices and the virtues, and you say each and every one is uh, love in disguise. Can you
Yes.
explain that a little bit more? And then I want to do an example. But
Yes. So all these words boil down to being different forms of love, and that's because they are all perfected in Jesus, who is love. And so these words that I use are the ancient seven capital vices. So we all kind of know those like pride, wrath, envy, so on and so forth. And in the medieval tradition, they were paired with remedy virtues, was what they called them.
Mhm,
So pride is paired with humility, or envy is paired with love. These are the virtues that kind of undo our patterns of vice in our life when we begin to practice them in the grace of God. And so what is so lovely is that each of these words, like humility, ends up being a form of love because humility is the medieval definition for humility. The most popular one was from Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who calls it true self-knowledge, especially in the context of our weaknesses and our failures and our need. And you're like, how does that doesn't really sound like love. But a modern day theologian, Joan Chittister, who is a Benedictine, she takes up this ancient idea of this proper self-knowledge, like of our need,
mhm,
and she calls it a proper sense of self in a universe of wonders, where you go, okay, to see my own littleness and my failures and my weaknesses, not as something to be threatened by, but as something to welcome about myself. Not that I'm like happy when I sin or fall short of something, but that I go, oh my gosh, the Lord has given me all these people and all these wonderful things that meet these needs. And then that begins to cultivate this love of self and
mhm,
love of the universe, like in its proper place, where I'm not trying to then control things or insert myself into sort of the role of the creator, but I'm appreciating how I am created, who I am in my particular context.
mhm,
Or you pick up a word like abstinence versus gluttony, which is another kind of unpleasant word. You go, oh,
mhm,
that just sounds like saying no to things all the time. But for medieval folks, it meant noticing where you were in the created world at any time. So, following feasts and fasts in the liturgical calendar, asking questions about how we consume, noticing the created world and becoming grateful and thankful for it rather than just consuming blindly
mhm.
whatever I want based on my desires, which is how we've gotten ourselves into a pickle with so
Yeah.
many things in modernity is just we're just following blindly whatever we want instead of looking at the context, long-term consequences of things, going, okay, here's a gift here that I can just relish and appreciate, and then there's a time where I need to say no to it.
Mhm,
And so that turns out to be a form of love as well for the created
mhm,
world. So
mhm,
all of these virtues, upon closer examination, turn out to be different forms of love for God, for our neighbor, for ourselves, for our enemies in
mhm.
surprising ways.
That's lovely and wonderful. And again, I think it just gives so much depth and to language, which you're great at, and also a reminder of how great that we have these amazing thinkers that I keep saying that, but that we get to
No, it's so
study
true.
and learn from. And don't skip over them. I just want
Mm-mm.
to encourage people, don't skip over these thinkers. I see this really big trend of people going back, which is great. Like this is good too. Like they're learning from ancient Near Eastern culture and
Yeah,
context, and that's awesome. That's
which
great
is
too.
amazing. Yes.
Yes, that's great too. But don't skip over this part either, because this part is how we got to where we are now,
Yeah.
right? And
Yes, so
so
true. No.
it's like,
And I
don't,
think like every piece of the church has something to give us. Like every era of the church has different flaws and different strengths that can help us better understand our calling right now in this world at this time,
right.
and that's the beauty of it.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally agree. So one thing you do, I think this was one of my favorite chapters, envy and love. And you have basilisk and blossom, which I love because, well, one, I just all I know about a basilisk is that's Harry Potter.
Absolutely.
That's all I know.
Yes.
So whatever. Don't judge me.
No, I
Um,
mean, I feel like most people are in that boat. And also, that's why it's fun to use anyway, because who doesn't have like a childhood association with the basilisk now because of that, you know?
fair. That's super fair. But like that's what I picture, and it gives such a good visual of like the way that you describe envy. And so for people listening who are like, I don't really know what the medieval authors have to offer me, right? I just want to touch on how you do this because again, it's very interesting and there's so much here. You give a great definition how envy can be hard to identify. I want to just look at a couple because I want people to know. Okay, so Thomas Aquinas describes it as sorrow, you say.
Hmm.
You also say envy is pain over the good fortune of others. Can you tell me a little bit more about this definition of envy?
Yes. So I think this is a place where I like a lot was clarified for me in writing this chapter because I used to think of envy as being just more like simple jealousy, where
Right.
you're like, I would like that. I wish that was mine, you know?
Yeah.
And what it actually is it's that kind of layer of jealousy, but it is something more insidious. It's about that they don't deserve it, I do deserve it. And then that extends into a sort of ill wishing for them, where the person you're envious of, it's not enough that you want something for yourself. You don't want it for them. And
Hmm.
you have active, Thomas Aquinas calls it sorrow, another thinker calls it pain. And why it's opposed to love is that that is sort of like antithetical to the Christian way of moving through the world, where we are called to mourn where others mourn and rejoice with others rejoicing. So we have this profound incarnational witness with other people, right? Where
Hmm.
we're like, okay, if you are in grief or in pain, I want to be with you. And if you are rejoicing and celebrating, I also want to be with you.
Hmm.
And envy does the exact opposite. Envy says, I'm happy when something goes poorly for you that I was jealous of, or I am sad when something is going well for you. I mourn when you rejoice, and I rejoice when you mourn. So it's
Hmm.
this total opposite.
The total
So it's a
opposite.
very toxic and poisonous and subtle because it's so unpleasant for us. No one likes feeling that way, so we hide it. We are very, we bury those feelings.
Hmm.
And then when they pop out, we're like, oh, wow. Okay, I I'm really embarrassed that that's there.
But also, I feel like we don't always have, again, like giving language to
Yeah.
that feeling is such a powerful thing to do. And then recognizing, oh, I'm being the opposite of love.
Yes.
That's a huge thing. So that's kind of, so you go and describe envy in that way. Again, I read the whole thing and I was just like, oh, oh, like
Yeah,
all these
totally.
new light bulbs coming on, like
Yeah.
okay, yeah. Like again, so much more depth, so much more color thinking about the language. I know you love, is it Julian of
Yes, I
Norwich?
love Julian of Norwich. She's one of my favorite writers ever. And I
Yeah.
tell an embarrassing little story in that chapter where I talk about I noticed a writer who's more successful than me further along the path was doing like a project related to her. And I thought to myself, I hope it sucks. And then I was horrified. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I just like thought that in my head. Like, what a crappy thing to do. And then being able to identify that as envy and as like kind of antithetical to my walk with Jesus and a real threat to my communion with others. And that's that kind of confessional movement is the beginning of being able to get
Mm,
rid of those things.
absolutely.
And to acknowledge them not it's embarrassing. It's rough. But that's the way that you can begin to strip yourself of it. Because the nice thing about envy is that it doesn't hold up that well under humor when you see it and you're like, wow, Grace, like
That
you
was
do
so
not
silly.
own Julian of Norwich. What the heck was that?
Yeah.
It begins to fall apart because you're holding it up in this sense of love of other and love of self and love of God, where you're like, that's
That
so ridiculous.
like that
Like,
was so silly. I know,
yes,
but
that was just so silly.
if people are honest, everybody's had moments like that, right?
Yes,
And
absolutely.
again,
It's why
like,
it's one of the capital vices. These are the things that kind of are so deep rooted in us, and so they stem from this very deep place, and we're
but what a
just
gift to be able to have language
yes,
and say, "Oh, that was envy." And that
yes,
was really silly of me. Like,
yes.
let's
And that's the
start.
opposite of that kind of shame, like hide it, don't acknowledge it, don't like,
Hmm.
I don't want to, I want to pretend like I don't feel that way. That's not gonna like work for me in the long run. That's not gonna make it go away. That's not going to lead to a more loving relationship. Whatever it is, fill in the blank. It's just gonna become more and more deeply embedded, like sink its claws into me, you know?
Right, like the basilisk. And
Like
it
the
does,
basilisk.
yes, and that doesn't lead to a more whole and holy life.
No,
It
no.
again, that just takes deeper root then. Okay, so on the opposite side of that, you're talking about love. You give the example of the blossom. There's this four-leafed flower. This was a medieval idea, correct? That
Yeah.
like tell me a little bit more about the blossom, the flower.
Yes. So common image in medieval ideas about love, they would use the quadrifoil, which was like scholars aren't exactly sure whether they were just talking about like a four-leaf clover or whether they were talking about a particular kind of flower with four petals, but it looked like a four-leaf clover in the sense that it's a four-petaled flower. And so medieval preachers would use that to remind people of the four objects of love. And so the first is love of God, and the second is love of self. And this is always fun because I feel like people are like, wait, medieval people thought you should love yourself? That sounds so modern. And of course, it's not the same as many of our modern ideas of self-love. But yes, medieval people took Christ's command very seriously. Love your neighbor as yourself. They recognized that that included both things and that actually you're not going to do a great job at loving your neighbor if you don't love yourself as well, and vice versa. So it's love of God, love of self, love of neighbor, and then love of enemy. And those are the four petals of the flower, and they're all held together, and they all kind of are of one piece, which is why the blossom picture is so lovely because they are all part of the same bloom of love, and they feed one another.
And I love this just because I did think about that, like love of self. Like I was like, oh, that's so interesting
Yeah.
that there was conversation about love of self during this time period because that seems like a new idea. But
Yeah.
it's again,
Not, I know,
it's
right? It's
not.
what you keep saying, where you're like, oh my gosh, it might have been couched in different terms or under a different vocabulary, but those questions that we wrestle with, they pop up in every period of history in different disguises, but they're there.
Hmm. And what's so cool is, yes, they're there in all of these places. They also give you some insight into how you can work through it, right?
Yeah.
So you're not stuck on your own. Like you really have people of the faith who have gone before you and are like, hey, I actually wrestled with this. So here's where here's the conclusion I came to. One thing you say that I really loved about this idea of love of self. True self love entails welcoming oneself as a dear friend of God. I
Yeah.
loved that. You gave the example of like God introducing you. Is that right? Like,
Yes.
um, so this is so and so, God's dear friend. And it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. No, and it contextualizes self-love where it's not some kind of like, I think sometimes we equate self-love with this like inflation of your
Yeah.
self-worth or something where you begin to see yourself as more important than you really are or whatever. But self-love is so simple as acknowledging. So medieval writers like Thomas Aquinas talk about how we learn to love God as a friend, and friendship is kind of the closest equivalent between God, human love. Like there's so many metaphors for it. There's like the God as romantic love. There's familial love. All of these are part of how God loves us, but Thomas Aquinas argued that the closest approximation is friendship because in friendship, it's this constant ongoing choice. It's not something that you are stuck in. It's something that you are always like, this is my friend, and I choose over and over and over to be present and to be here for them and to be in communion with them. Whereas, like a parent-child relationship, a lot of times when you're a parent, you're like, well, today was tough and I just have to there's
You're
no
stuck with
yeah,
me.
this is
I'm
it,
stuck with you.
this is
Yeah.
it. And you still love them, obviously, but there's that element. That's not how God feels about you. And so thinking of yourself as God's friend is actually a really a closer approximation to self-love than a lot of other things where you're like, if God loves me as a friend, I should also love myself as a friend. Like
Hmm.
that's an interesting idea. That's challenging.
Right. And you talk about how in the medieval time period they saw uh was it love is flowing? Like very
Yeah.
much like imagery of flowing. And I think about how, okay, well then that has to flow then
Yes.
into love of neighbor and into love of enemy. It has to.
Yes. And that's the kind of idea. If God loves you as you are, if God chooses you for his friend, and he does that for every other person in the world, then love of enemy and love of neighbor are also tied to self-love and to love of God. They are all held together by that same logic that can't break because you go, well, you're God's friend. That person that I hate and think is kind of evil, God wants to be their friend. Like all of this is held together. And then you can't do this picking and choosing of like what
Mhm.
people are worthy of love and what people are not.
Yeah,
That's
that
not
really kind of goes against a lot of, things that we might naturally prefer.
absolutely. Absolutely. It's like it remains the hardest and most radical of Christ's commandments. Love your enemy is never going to be like this simple, nice, straightforward proposition. And nonetheless, like you can't argue your way around it. Like there it is. And that's the that's the moral
It is.
call. I mean,
It's what it is.
that's what it
And
is.
and again love the use. I really do love the use of the blossom of the flower, right? Like all held together as one. So that's just a small example of all the awesome things that you do in the book. Again, it's called Ask of Old Paths, Medieval Virtues and Vices for a Whole and Holy Life. I was just like, I've got all these things marked. I just think it's really cool.
Oh, thanks so much. I really
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Uh, and like I said, if you are listening to this and you're like, whoa, I never really paid much attention to medieval time period or what they can teach me about my faith today, absolutely worth your time. There's so much to learn. Before we go, I have two final questions for you. I ask these of everybody, and you can answer them in whichever order you prefer.
All right.
Don't worry, they're simple. The first question is, do you have a spiritual discipline that you engage in at this time that just helps you feel closer to the Lord? The reason I ask this question is I feel like sometimes our spiritual practices can get a little mundane. And sometimes when we hear what other people do, maybe we can adopt that for ourselves, or there's pieces of it that we can adopt, exchange, change, that works for our lives as well. Because, right, I mean, sometimes we just need a new idea. So if you have a spiritual discipline,
Mm-hmm.
um, and then the other question is, what is something in your life that is bringing you delight right now? And it doesn't have to be like deep and meaningful. It can
Mm-hmm.
literally be, oh, I saw the sun today. How delightful. So just something, it can be frivolous. I always say, I think joy runs really deep, and we always have that joy of Christ. What a blessing, what a gift. But we can also take time to find like moments. Like God wants us to enjoy our lives as well. So something delightful.
Yes. Well, the spiritual discipline that I have been practicing in my life is that I have found in this while launching a book and while like having to do a lot more with like social media and all this online stuff, not like deep in my writing as much as I usually am, I feel a lot more distracted and I feel a lot more like kind of flighty and erratic. And so what I've been doing is praying with prayer beads because I'm less distracted when I'm holding on and doing something with my hands.
Mm.
So I have a rosary, even though I am a Protestant. And I pray variants of ancient prayers from the church with it. And it really helps me because I feel like then I don't lose my attention as quickly. Like I just feel like my attention has been just destroyed in the past like few years. And this has been a really good way for me to ground my prayers again and to be able to think of different people and pray for them really intentionally while I'm like holding the beads and to be super intentional with my body while I pray. And so that's one thing, that's my spiritual discipline that I have been practicing lately. And I really recommend it if you feel really distracted and really kind of like all over the place in your
Yeah, give your
prayers.
hands something to do. I've
Yes.
I've literally had to so one of my spiritual practices is I lay on my office floor. I usually find a spot that's sunny and I listen to like the Lectio Divina devotional for the day. It's like typically around like 10 minutes, but I will literally have to sit on my hands or like put them up,
Yes.
lay down and because my
Do that, right?
I will try to multitask.
Yes, I will too.
I'm like,
And
don't
it's like
what?
I'll do it even without thinking. I'll just like head into whatever, start thinking about my day or planning or whatever.
Hmm.
And it's just like if you have something, yeah, like sitting on your hands or laying down, or for me, holding on to the beads and moving them as I pray for different things, pray for different people, recite the Lord's Prayer, whatever it is. But
Hmm.
it helps me so much and it
Yeah,
helps me to be more consistent, which
yeah.
really matters for me.
I genuinely would give that a try because maybe that would help me, like even just as I'm,
Exactly. It's
yeah.
very tactile. I often do it while I go on walks because then I'm like walking, getting my fresh air, blah, blah, blah. But then I can pray the whole time versus like I would before, like maybe be like, oh, I'm gonna go on a walk and pray a little bit, but I'd pray for like 30 seconds and then be
Yeah.
like, a bird or whatever,
Yeah. You're
Like,
like, how long have I been walking?
yeah.
You're like,
No.
oh.
So it's really lovely to just move your hands and move your lips while you're doing and just really lean in to the
Mhm.
tactile and the physical aspect of being an embodied person,
Yes, a whole person.
whole person. Yeah.
Yep. Hmm.
And then what I've been getting delight from lately is my garden. I am not a very good gardener, but I do have a lot of fun with it. And we have like a bunch of little tiny pumpkins that are
Ooh.
starting to get orange. And I love to just go look at them
Yeah.
every day and just check on them, see how they're doing. We also have a lot of tomatoes that are still in full harvest. And my kids will just go outside and eat like 30 of them, just like go to
Yes.
town. And all that brings me a lot of joy because it's so satisfying to watch something
Yeah.
grow, like really. So like you watch your kids grow, that's wonderful, but that's so tangled up in so many things. And also like there's some anxiety,
Yeah.
and the garden is like, well, I don't want it to not do well, but if it doesn't do well, that was
It'll
this
be all right.
that was an
Yeah.
experiment. I'll try again next year,
Yeah.
different. And so it's so peaceful. It's such like a peaceful kind of joy of just watching things grow.
And then you get to eat whatever
And then you
comes
get
out
to
of
eat
it.
them. And then you get to decorate your house with the little tiny pumpkins. And then
Yeah.
there's just so many fun, silly
Yeah.
things.
Fun.
Then you get to pull weeds when you're really angry about something. Like,
Uh-huh. Yeah, let out some aggression as you
exactly. No,
working
there's so
through.
many bonuses to it.
Yeah. As you're like, oh, I was feeling envy. Oh, darn it.
Totally.
You're like,
Exactly.
yeah, there is something though, I feel like about physical labor that helps with all
Yes.
that. There's
Yes.
something to it. Where can we find you? Where can people find all your goodness?
You can find me on Instagram. I'm at Old Books with Grace. I have a podcast of that same name, Old Books with Grace, where I talk with different guests about the literature and theology of the past. And then I also have a Substack newsletter that goes out once a month, and it's called Medievalish, and it talks about thinks with different medieval and early modern writers and ideas, and kind of then fills you in on what I'm up to and all that kind of stuff. And then you can buy Ask of Old Paths anywhere that you buy your books, and you can also find out more about it on my website, gracehamman.com, if you are curious. So,
Amazing.
for all the things.
All the things. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. It's great. I love it. Very cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for reading. Thank you for having me on. It was a great conversation.